Fine print. The Starport was always a hive of activity, but things were different now. Every berth at the dock was full, but not a single ship had been allowed to unload its goods. The port's personnel held picket lines, standing shoulder to shoulder with one another and shouting loud enough that every mic pointed their way could pick up their demands. Stun batons and looted riot gear had been spread around, and more than one worker still bore the split lips and swollen eyes from their fights with station security personnel. Standoff had been happening for nearly 5 days now, and things were starting to get truly serious. It was movement at Gate 19 that sent a stir through the gathered picketers. Armored figures were moving in lockstep through the access halls. At first they thought it was station security having another go, but as this force drew closer, the dock workers realized their mistake. These troops weren't wearing the regulation gray of the company corps. Some were outfitted in black and red, with the mirrored visors commonly seen among high-speed teams that specialized in boarding actions. Peppered in through the ranks were fighters in hard-worn green and brown, each of them with silver studs in their ears and hash marks on the butts of their weapons. A small squad bore long stiletto daggers with roaring dragons on the pommels, and there were a handful of soldiers who stood head and shoulders above their compatriots, each hefting weapons that made the slabs of muscles in their arms stand out in stark relief. The only thing they all had in common was the guild patch on their shoulders and chest pieces, a white skull over 2 cross rifles. Harriers. Walking at the head of the company was a man with graying hair, dressed in outdated fatigues and an old-fashioned armor set. All it took was one look in his eyes to know he was still an operator, though. Walking beside him was a tall, thin man in rimless spectacles. The thin man's eyes were watery, and he had a habit of licking his lips. He wore a button-down shirt and slacks, but the bureaucrat may as well have had a company uniform with his name, rank, and serial number on the breast, identifying him as the representative of the powers that be, who wanted their port to return to status quo. The man with the gray hair raised his fist, and the troops at his back halted. For a moment, everything was still. Then the leader spread his fingers, and the figures behind him moved. The heavy-shouldered grenadiers took up the rearguard position, while the shooters in green moved behind steel-sided transport cubes that provided heavy cover. The troopers in black and red advanced out to the flanks, ensuring they had an open field of fire and plenty of free movement. The commander didn't bother watching them. Instead, he walked out to no man's land with the nervous-looking company rep at his side and stood at ease. Ripples went through the protesters, and for a moment it looked like they would break, either into a retreat or an attack. In the end, they held their ground. The line of protesters parted, and a man stepped out. He was broad-shouldered and ragged, dressed in tattered overalls. His arm was bandaged, and the sides of his face were swollen and bruised, but the fire in his eyes burned hot. The commander of the Harriers stopped and waited, tucking his thumbs behind his belt. The company man licked his lips, his eyes darting from one man to another. "A lot of folks you got here," the commander said, with the air of a man remarking on the weather. "There's more on the way," the workers' rep said. "You all need to clear out of here," the thin man said, squaring his shoulders. "This has gone far enough, but it's time for—" The commander didn't say anything. He just shifted his gaze. The words dried up on the bureaucrat's lips, like the Harrier had turned a faucet. Once he was sure the company man wasn't going to interrupt, he turned back to the voice of the protest. "What's the nature of the complaint?" the commander asked. The man with the bloody arm drew his lips back from his teeth like an angry dog. "Nature of the complaint? Illegal hours, cut corners on safety equipment, refusal of medical care, and then when we refuse to work under these conditions, they bring in the brute squad to bust our heads. You need me to go on?" "No," the commander said. He glanced past the main dock worker, noticing the numbers behind him were growing. Not significantly, but they were growing all the same. "I'm assuming you filed the appropriate papers for unionizing." "I don't see how that's—" the bureaucrat started, but the worker talked over him. "We delivered the petition in person," the man said. "All 3 of our people were fired on the spot, and one of them got his teeth cracked for his trouble." The commander turned to look at the bureaucrat. The thin man flinched as if the soldier had drawn back a hand to strike him. When the blow didn't land, the man stood a little straighter, his tongue darting out over his lips. This true? The commander asked.
I don't see how that's relevant to the job you were hired to do, the thin man said.
The commander pursed his lips and nodded his head once. He raised a hand to the earpiece he wore and pushed the button twice. Every soldier returned the signal, then lowered their weapons. The thin man's eyes bulged, staring from the commander to the dock full of angry workers, then back again.
Just what do you think you are doing? He demanded.
Here's what's going to happen, the commander said, turning back to the thin man. You're going to go back to your bosses and you're going to explain to them that they are going to sit down to negotiate with the dockers here. They're going to negotiate in good faith, and they are not going to use any more of their bully boy tactics. They try, and there's going to be body bags. You have my word on that.
You can't do that,
the thin man said. The commander rested his hand on his sidearm. I can, and I am, he said. And when you're done telling them to get their lawyers together, remind them to reread Section 86 of the contract they signed with my guild. They're on the hook for all fees and expenses we incur as long as we're here protecting this legally allowed unionization effort. Tick-tock, little man.